Tom Quee presents The Royle Ramble, an episode-by-episode celebration of the classic British sitcom The Royle Family. To get in touch with the show, email us at theroyleramblepod@gmail.com.
Hey everyone, it's Tom here. We're back with another edition of The Royle Ramble, or should I say Blurting Mrs. Merton, because there has been a sea change here at the podcast now. We are done, unfortunately, with the Royle Family, entirely. We've covered everything. Maybe there'll be some lost, deleted scenes that we haven't mentioned, but essentially the show is done, as you know. And now we are moving on to the Mrs. Merton show. And this is very exciting for me because it's a different change of pace. It's not the sort of the deep solo trawl through these scripts. We're going to have guests on. We're going to have listeners on, and we're going to be going through in order every episode of the Mrs. Merton show in detail. There is a huge tranche of legendary, slightly forgotten 90s celebrities that await us in these conversations that I'm really excited to reference and get into. And just before we get to the guest today and the episode, of course, if you enjoy the show, you can go on to Patreon. We are doing the Grapes tapes over there. We are doing our special subscriber-only series on Early Doors. First series is done now. So all 6 episodes of the masterpiece that is the first series of Early Doors is available there if you want to support. Also, these episodes will be on there early, as well as editions of the British Film Club. And if you want to get in touch with me and you want to come on at this show, because I would love to have more and more guests on this show, the Royle Ramble Pod at gmail.com. Get in touch with me there. And I'll let you know what Mrs. Merton show we're going to cover, and you can make some notes. We'll put a little Zoom date in our calendars, and we'll get it done. But my guest today, very excited to have this guy on the show because he published this incredible article actually about the Royle Family at 25 that was a terrific read, and how we initially got in touch. Fergal, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on your excellent podcast.
I appreciate that, and this is in the Tribune magazine, which is a proper magazine. This wasn't some blog, right? This is a real article.
Yeah, so Tribune, where I work as culture editor, is like a long-standing socialist left, but also culture, various other things magazine. And it would have been 2 years ago, wouldn't it? The 25th anniversary.
Yes, 23.
I managed to persuade my higher ups that actually, if you're talking about class and British television, really, there was a gap in the market for a really long, possibly too long and in-depth piece about Caroline Aherne. And
you're speaking to me, man. I go too long in depth, so I loved it.
Yeah, no, of course. Obviously, you're also the master of going deep on that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think it was coming to a few years ago. It was before the Caroline Aherne Arena documentary, but it was a couple of years after passing, and there was I think there was a bit of a lull, which you're going to get in people thinking about her. And so part of the reason I wanted to do it as well was there's a bit of a contemporary debate that you'll see in the news right now about getting people from working class backgrounds into television, lack of opportunity. And so I've written about Dennis Potter, I've written about Caroline Aherne, and you just have to look at these figures and actually a kind of more complex picture emerges about how the way Britain's economy was geared in, the 70s, 80s, 90s made it a lot easier for working class people to get into the media, to make programs like The Royle Family that deal really explicitly and in a fun and interesting way with class. That's on the Tribune website. It's for free if people are listening want to read it.
Yeah, we'll put the link down below. It is an excellent piece. But your own personal history briefly with the Royle Family then, when did you start watching?
Yeah, so what year were you born in, if you don't mind?
No, I was born in 1992.
Okay, yeah, so very similar to me. I was born in 93. I've got no memory of the original run. Part of me feels like I remember an advert for the 3rd series once Baby David was there, but possibly that was a gold advert repeat. It's hard to...
I kind of know the advert you're talking about.
Yeah.
Although just to jump in, I do remember the original series. I do remember watching when we first met Roger and Valerie I remember being surrounded by toys and it was on TV. It's weird. It's a weird primal memory, but sorry, please. Yeah.
So that would have been Christmas Day then when it went out on transmission.
That would have been on 2000, Christmas Day 2000.
Yeah, fantastic. So really it was the first adult culture, culture for grown-ups that I remember enjoying. Kind of everything before that had been sort of stuff aimed at kids. Because it was just repeated quite a lot on Gold, and my mum and dad, who had been, they're quite interesting because they weren't massive people for loads and loads of culture, but they'd watch Mrs. Merton, they've really followed that. They've really followed the royal family. I think like I'm from Blackburn, and for a lot of people in the
Mm,
northwest, they felt really seen and heard by what Carolina Hearn was doing. That they wouldn't have used that kind of terminology.
yeah.
So yeah, so me and my brother would just all the time watch the royal family on Gold. As soon as we, like Jim, at the end of series three, as soon as we got, but his was with Sky, but as soon as we got a DVD player, the first thing we bought was kind of the cheaply available box set
Yeah.
DVD. And it just became really something to that, like a lot of culture when you're a kid, you go back to it a few years later, and every time I went back to it, there was just all these different resonances to it. When I was in my teens, you could get a really interesting watch out of it and just realize just how sophisticated as a comedy it was. In your early 20s, kind of some of the more political resonances of
Mm.
just Carolina Hearn as a working class woman started to come through. And I'm sort of overdue another watch now. I'm sort of 31 and see what will come through. Though it kind of it's never left me like particularly. Like, I live in London now, and if I've got a friend visiting from the north after like too many drinks, it is the sort of go-to program that will end up coming on.
Well, no, I like what you're saying there, and it's so true. And I think future resonances, maybe in our futures, but certainly for people our ages, when you're a parent, right? Like the show is so much about being a parent and so much about, Bob's incredible, kind of beautiful way she raises kids, and Denise's like abject, like abandonment of motherhood and like all that thing, and the way Jim is, and the way parents can sculpt children as well.
Oh yeah, the stuff about parenthood, that is actually something I've been thinking about quite a lot with it, in the sense that I think seems to be common with a lot of the people I know who are my age or into the royal family. My house wasn't exactly like the royals, but my nan and granddad, my grandparents' house, it certainly was.
Mm.
And then you watch it now and you realize, oh yeah, of course, because what you are watching really is a show where the plates that are moving over that series is Jim and Barbara going from being parents to becoming grandparents. We've all seen that in our own lives. And so, yeah, as I'm older, I have an understanding of that. They've kind of reached the end of the journey of how much they can really do to alter or change Anthony or Denise. The show is really good about kind of the different paths available to Anthony and what he could take and stuff. And yet, them becoming grandparents and the way that people spoil grandkids and overlook certain things, and that first year of when a grandchild arrives and people's behavior changes. So, yeah, as you said with future residences, there's all this subtlety to it that every time I come back, there's just these different things.
There are, and I mean, even future residences, as a final point on Royal Family, being a grandparent, grandchildren, like, being like Norma. Maybe when I'm Norma's age, if the world's around, I'll be like, she was right. Like, I get what she's saying.
Yeah, I mean, this links in with possibly what is if you were to actually sum up what the great theme of all the Carolina Hearn work is, it is actually this deep immersion in old biddies and old
It,
people. And it's old people in a way that, this makes me sound like an old person, but proper old people. When people in the 60s and 70s, when there was a really defined generation gap,
mm,
which I see in the royal family, with Liz Smith's character. Yeah, and so I mean the way that Carolina Hearn, certainly through Mrs. Merton, which we're about to talk about, and then into the royal family, was just able to have all these really sort of well observed nuances about, yeah, elderly people in Britain, and what a shame it is really that Carolina Hearn didn't get to become an old woman herself, because she would have been a pretty fantastic one, I think.
no, that's a fair point, and it's like it's so weird, isn't it? Because I think it's an extinct. Getting on to Mrs. Merton now.
Hmm.
So the sort of the world that Mrs. Merton projects, and you're right, it is all about nans and nanecdotes. And, I'm coining it, by the way, the Ahernverse. That's like the Carolyn Ahern cinematic universe. Like anything that's sort of, early doors is in that. Mrs. Merton, anything that she's kind of tangentially into, whatever. But I was thinking this, Ferg, I don't know about you. I feel like this type of nan that is immortalized in Mrs. Merton, I feel like they don't really exist anymore. I feel like they existed when we were kids. I feel like you have glam grands now, don't you? Like the dominant form of nans. I don't think in 30 years nans are going to be like this.
No, where I guess something like Motherland is probably the thing to watch if you want to
Mm,
observe how and grandparents are different now.
yes.
But you're absolutely correct. I think that, I mean, it's made more explicit with who the old people in the audience is, but it does, I get a sense that Mrs. Merton is much more a reflection of the old people who were knocking around when Carolina Hearn
Yeah,
was growing up in the
yeah,
1970s and 80s, without being like one of those Facebook pages of who remembers proper bin men. It's a really
yeah.
like
Right.
old woman sort of archetype. I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. So I guess
Yeah.
it's just a society with just a much harder and more rigid generation gaps, which you sort of see in the royal family, in which the reason why the show is such a great times capsule is some of that stuff has broken down a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So this is the Mrs. Merton show. And I must say that before doing this podcast, I was aware of this. I was aware of the millionaire Paul Daniels line and stuff like that. I'd seen it on Channel 4's Top 100, whatever. And I knew Carolyn Ahern was obviously involved, this Craig Cash, Henry Normal, etc., Dave Gorman. But I hadn't really watched it until I really did the program, did the podcast, and then came across the program. What about yourself? Was it something you were familiar with? Or?
Oh, I'm really relieved you said that actually, because I was always aware of it. Actually, one of my like Proustian childhood memories of watching the royal family is my mum pointing out that the Denise character, that was actually who wrote it, and she had this thing before called Mrs. Merton. But when
Right.
I
Wow.
was in I was a kid and in my teens, early 20s, if
Mm.
you wanted to watch Mrs. Merton, it would be, I'm aware now there was a DVD release, but I certainly never saw it. It would be really grainy on YouTube. And so actually my sort of like my personal story with Mrs. Merton as a program only begins after I'd written that Tribune article on Christmas Day when they showed
Right.
the documentary and quite a, obviously really sad ending to that. And immediately
Mm.
after, they followed with the episode we're about to talk about. And I was watching that with my sister and my dad, and I think my mum had fallen asleep, much like Nana Royle. And we were just watching that and thought it was absolutely hilarious. So the BBC. I'm really glad iPlayer put all that stuff up on iPlayer. It still sits there for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just blown away, really. I think that because I mean, like, I'm very similar to you. I'm a big Alan Partridge fan, and knowing me, knowing you, I would put it's kind of the B rank of that stuff. It hasn't always aged amazing. There's bits I love, there's
No.
bits that don't really make sense. I was just so shocked while watching Mrs. Merton show just how good it is, how much it stood the test of time, how watchable Carolina Hearn is in it. I guess if you've like us, only ever grown up watching her in a scripted environment, but you've heard other people talk about what a great comedic mind she was, sort of
Mm.
in an improv way. To watch, and we'll come on to the things she's able to come out with out of the spur of the moment.
Yeah.
It's astonishing TV.
Yeah, it is. And I'm glad you brought Alan Partridge up because obviously that is the comparison. And they even mention it in the episode, which I love. They just get it, but we'll get to that. But yes, I guess the major difference is they're both scripted chat shows to a certain extent. But obviously Alan Partridge, all the guests are fake. Whereas all the guests are real here. So they can't
Mhm.
really script things to a massive degree. It's more kind of like, the questions are scripted to a certain extent or whatever. But like you say, yeah, I think the reason why the show is so vibrant and so fresh is she is quite electrifying, actually, despite the old person makeup and that persona. And that definitely adds to it. But you feel like she's really kind of thinking every time someone says something. And she always gets out funny lines and good put downs and like just stuff that feels off the cuff. Like there's nothing rehearsed about it. It really is quite beguiling.
Yeah, and you don't actually see that. I think what's so interesting about it is when you watch her as Mrs. Merton, you don't see those gears whirring behind her head at all.
No.
There is no evidence that she is about to come out with a zinger, so it kind of makes it all the more satisfying. Yeah, as you said, it's really electrifying television. You're kind of watching in this studio this person who. 'Cause I mean, I was listening to your earlier episode, and that she'd actually been doing that character since 1988. So
Mm,
she's really, she's lived in it. And I guess like without trying to do too much pop psychology about it, I think for someone like Caroline Ahern who spoke about being shy, struggling to talk about herself in a media environment, the freedom conferred by masks to be able to have on a wig and be this different character, it did seem to make her be this, really ultra vivid version of herself.
yeah, exactly. And you're right. It's like it maybe could have worked on some level if it was just the Carolyn Ahern show and she's super acidic and she's super acerbic and she's kind of like Merton. But I feel like the old ladiness of it, the nanification of it, the fact that the audience is mostly these grannies and they're the ones that are mostly cool to, and like you talk about the naturalness and the lack of gears whirring as well. It is amazing how mid anecdote you'll conversationally just turn to one of the grannies in the audience and ask them something, riff on that, and then return to the guest. It's quite masterful how she does it.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned about kind of the way she will interrupt an anecdote. I think it's the disrespect for celebrity culture that she has in it,
Oh
which is
yeah, oh yeah,
so
yeah,
funny and irreverent about it. These people have obviously gone there to kind of promote something or to promote themselves, and she will just undercut that by asking, by asking Maureen or whoever it is behind.
yeah.
And no, that really works as a huge source of its comedy. I mean, in general,
Mm.
just the decision to have the studio audience made up of people from Wythenshawe and mates and stuff, it just gives it this real lift.
Yeah.
The audience are on Caroline's side in a way that you might not get in another thing. Did you listen to that? Around the time the Arena documentary came out,
Mm.
there was a really good podcast interview with Craig Cash on Jeff Lloyd's podcast about
Oh,
television.
I love Jeff Lloyd. No, I didn't know about that.
Wow, yeah, it wasn't
Oh.
considering how much of a goldmine this interview was. It wasn't really
Mm.
publicized too much. So, kind of the only interview Craig Cash did around that Arena documentary was with Jeff Lloyd. It's about 45 minutes. I'll send you the link after, you can put in the show
Please.
notes.
Well, yeah.
But there's really funny anecdotes that I won't try and do justice to about the experience of filming Mrs. Merton, the kind of high tensions on set, and the quite boozy goings on afterwards. It really puts you in that time frame. It's if you're a fan like you are and myself, it's really good.
That sounds great. And yeah, Jeff Floyd from Pete and Jeff is how I remember him from Virgin Radio's legendary Breakfast Zoo show. And that has the rare accolade. And it's so funny you bring this up, Ferg, because you're unlocking all these memories. The first podcast I ever downloaded had Jeff Lloyd on it. It was Pete and Jeff.
All right.
And you're from my era. I'm slightly older than you, but only slightly. But I'm from the era where you downloaded a podcast on iTunes on your computer and you dragged it onto your iPod for a Firewire. There was none of this Wi-Fi bullshit back then. So, there were some
Yeah, it might
true
have been
fans.
the Ricky Gervais podcast.
Slightly, yeah, yeah. I
I
remember
remember doing
the
exactly.
Guardian Unlimited era. Like it was, yeah, it was a whole vibe. But Mrs. Merton, then. So we begin, and one of the things that I found really surprising when I was digging into this show a few years ago, I got the DVD set because you mentioned it's on iPlayer, but they're not all on there, I should add. There's
Yeah, do
there's
you want
like
to explain a little bit about the episodes that are missing? Because there seems to be a bit of a through line of the reasons why some of those episodes aren't on iPlayer.
yeah, I mean it was sort of a misguided sojourn right to Vegas, and they did these episodes in America that weren't very well received. I need to rewatch those. And there's also a short documentary episode as well that isn't on there that documents Mrs. Merton and the plane load of pensioners going off to Sin City.
Okay, that's interesting. The only, obviously, I've not watched those episodes, but if you look at the ones on BBC iPlayer
Mm.
that are missing, there's a couple where some of the guests have since been slightly disgraced by Operation Yewtree and various things. So some of the,
Oh, yes.
yeah,
Yeah,
without getting into libel or anything.
sure,
But
sure.
those are some of the things that you miss with iPlayer. But the majority of the sort of canonical episodes are all there.
Yes, yes. And it's funny you mention that actually because the early doors got edited on iPlayer for a Jimmy Savile joke. But
Oh, it's a shame because that joke is really funny. But
yes,
yeah.
but weirdly, there is another Jimmy Savile reference in early doors that hasn't been edited out.
Oh, well,
So
let's hope
it's
nobody at BBC
the
complains
big
about
wigs are listening to blurting Mrs. Merton. I know they are. So, but one of the things that I loved, sorry, about Mrs. Merton digging into it was, and watching it for the first time, I remember thinking, oh my God, this show has an amazing theme tune. Like,
it's
it's a
excellent.
banger.
Put the washing out in range. Your legs are full of aches and pains. The fine rain soaring in the street. A cul-de-sac. So let the happy times begin. 'Cause Mrs. Merton's here again. She'll share the joy that's in her heart throughout the world.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what do you know about the composition of that theme tune? Do you know anything at all?
I know it's from Hooky and the Boys.
Right.
So,
So they
yeah,
wrote because obviously the bass riff from Hooky, and again that's something we'll have to talk about in a sec. The
yes.
bass riff does seem to reference New Order, like can't remember exactly which New Order track it is off the top of my head.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
it
didn't.
has
Okay,
that
that's interesting.
lilt to
Yeah.
it towards the end and stuff. Oh, so I didn't know if I didn't know that that was Peter Hook credit because I've
I
tried.
believe it. I
Yeah,
believe it
that makes
is.
sense, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, yeah, actually, it's fantastic.
it is fun. Yeah, it's so buoyant, and we'll cut in a clip right now so you guys can listen to it. But yeah, I mean, as a tune really, and as an accompaniment to an opening sequence where Mrs. Merton is knocking on all these doors of all these slightly doddering elderly people, lamenting crime and back pains and whatnot, and it's all meant ironically and tongue in cheek, and I get that. But I don't know, the vision of her with this militia of matrons behind her on these cobbled streets and balloons flying and this song roaring. It's quite a stirring opening.
Yeah, I mean, even the image of her in that, it's quite camp. It seems to
Yeah,
reference, it puts me in mind of like 60s British culture with the kind of
for sure,
cobbled
for sure.
terrace. It's really, really uplifting for what it is. Yeah, no, it's an absolutely fantastic. So that isn't there in the Granada palette, I assume.
No, no, this was an original, like when it was
Yeah,
on the Beeb.
yeah,
But no,
fantastic.
that wasn't covered there. But yeah, it's just, I don't know. It has that kind of uplift, as you say, and we get into the set itself. And there is something so gloriously beige talk show about this whole setup, right? Like, obviously, it's lampooning all that sort of stuff. And it's kind of anchored within, the chat shows that Karen and Ahern would have grown up on, like what Alan Titchmarsh sketch mentioned, but Terry Wogan, and all these weird 90s angular lights and the LEDs that look like stars. And what I love most, Fergal, about these shows, it reminds me of Kilroy and Trisha, the kind of elevated audience. Like, it doesn't matter where the camera is, if it's on Merton or the interviewee, but there's a lot of faces that you can see reacting and smiling. Like, I love the setup.
Oh yeah, and actually you realise that becomes more powerful to it than just the sound of the laughter. Seeing these people's
Yes,
faces
it does.
greasing up and stuff is really good. I mean, I guess as well. I mean, in terms of the actual evening it was transmitted, I was looking at that. So it was
Oh,
broadcast
okay.
on Friday, the 10th of February, 1995.
Mm.
So if you decided not to go to the pub that night, you would have got at 10 o'clock two repeat episodes of the day to day, which links in with who the guest
That's pretty
was.
strong. That's good viewing.
Yeah, then news night, and then at 11:15, yeah, the Mrs. Merton show, and then followed by that was a sort of cartoon about a duck detective with the music of Frank Zappa, which I don't think has
No.
been. Yeah, I have no knowledge of that, but that sounds like quite
I, I,
entertaining.
I I love Zappa and I love his sort of animation work. So yeah, I need to check that.
Okay, yeah, Duckman, it's called. So that
Duckman.
was if
Okay.
you made it to the end of Mrs. Merton, you were treated with
But
Duckman.
it's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's meant to be a sort of 7:30 tea time show. That's what it's kind of meant to be, but it's played late at night, right? Because it is very risque. Like a lot of the stuff that they suggest in this, I was like, bloody hell, this is kind of like ribald.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of, I think you don't really hear this term anymore, but it would have been that kind of post-pub broadcasting, which the word at the same time was
Hmm.
obviously the masterpiece of. So I guess the kind of you can imagine the meetings at the BBC would have been, well, it's this young Carolina Hearn, it's Peter Hook, it's anarchic. Let's put it on
Yeah.
late at night. I don't think anybody at the time would have foreseen that this would have been the person who, in a couple of years' time, would be crossing over to, prime time BBC One.
Hmm. Hmm. No, for sure. So yes, it opens up, as I say, the traditional set, the pensioners that we see, and I'm a big fan, Fergal, in general, of American late night television. Like I
Mhm.
don't watch it regularly, but there's sort of the legacy of Carson and Letterman and Leno and Conan, and I love all that stuff. I listen to a lot of podcasts on that stuff. And one of the main things I love about it is the house bands.
Yeah.
I love the idea of a house band. And obviously, Merton is a satirical chat show in this vein, but like Partridge, it has a fictional house band here with Hooky and the boys. And, I want to give a quick shout out to Kevin Eubanks from Jay Leno's house band. That's my personal favorite house band at the late 90s until the end of Leno in '09 when he sort of ruined Conan's career. But Hooky and the boys. Now, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because if they were really sort of playing to type here, surely Mrs. Merton's house band should be like an old, 60, 70,000. But I find it hilarious that they're just like a rip rocking, roaring, leather pants, bass driven assault.
Now, every woman's dream is to marry Paul Daniels. This dream came true for the lovely Debbie McGee, and she'll be popping up later. So that'll please my regular band Hookie and the boys. Quite musical, that. They didn't half perk up a bit when I told them Debbie was on, and you can't move here for the stench of Old Spice. You know, normally they don't wash. But without further ado...
Yeah, they're really leathery, they're really hairy, and I guess it works because Mrs. Merton is able to get some kind of humour out of the fact that she's very different to that band, and there's kind of rock and roll people in the studio, and it kind of offends her sensibilities. But I guess I wonder if some of that as well would have been... So, I mean, in the episode and in TV guides at the time, she was billed as Caroline Hook. She would have, I guess, BBC commissioners, it would have also been part of it of, well, there is, there's one semi-famous person and another semi-famous person, put them together. But it does, I mean, obviously, we know about what happened with the marriage of Peter Hook, and it was a very unhappy period. Very brief time capsule where about 6 months before they got married in Las Vegas. And if I similar to me, there was something quite annoying. I really love a lot of 80s and 90s Manchester music culture, and even when people are quite nostalgic and boring about it, I really love that stuff. And
no, it's the best. It's such a
exactly. I think Manchester have it going on about it a lot, but when I'm, I see something like that, we think about, it's Peter Hook and Caroline.
I know, it's Peter Hook from Joy Division. Like, what the hell?
Yeah. It just adds this surrealness of it. Yeah. And I think the way that Caroline Aherne links in with this music culture is interesting. Like, so her and Hook meet at the Hacienda. Obviously, there is Caroline Ahern's association with Chris Sivvy, and the way that he's outside the musician as well as a comedy figure. So, yeah, you have just got this weird Manchester music-y stuff going on.
Yes. And you're tapping into, again, the Aherne-verse there. Because I was thinking Chris Sivvy would have been cool if it wasn't Hooky. Chris Sivvy doing, like, not even as a Frank thing, just as a whatever thing, going down a different way. But another reason I love Hooky and the Boys is I mentioned the late night bands before. And one of the things that I like about them is that they all play with the lead instrument. So Kevin Eubanks is on guitar, as I mentioned. Conan has Max Weinberg on drums. Letterman has Paul Schaefer on the keys. And here we have a lead bass player. Like, I just think that's a kind of cool little twist.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It's really unorthodox. I hadn't picked out. Yeah, because the melody is coming out on the bass.
Pretty much, yeah. Like a lot of Joy Division and New Order, like it's that same sort of timbre of the lead bass, and it's really, really cool for it. But just before we get into the interviews, then we have Mrs. Merton. I keep trying to call her Caroline, but I'm saying Mrs. Merton. Mrs. Merton speaking to the camera. Again, we can appreciate all the people behind. She's giving some funny asides, What does she say? She welcomes everyone to the show. The guests are such a high calibre. I don't really know why she sort of hangs on that. It's not really a Merton thing, but she mispronounces that word, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, some of the little lexicon tricks that are going on with Calibra and the way vowel sounds are always slightly misdone, because that's not really an accent she's doing. It's just kind of old people garbling their words slightly, which is actually funnier. Yeah.
But it's basically, she said she didn't almost get them, but who can resist 2,000 quid and the chance to show off in front of millions? Not Steve Coogan, that's for sure. And even she has that conversational, he's on tonight, and it's just kind of like this whole welcome to the show thing, but it's also welcome to this show where it's not, despite it looking like a sort of cozy thing, a Richard and Judy thing, I am not interested in these celebrities in any standard way. I am mocking them, and they enjoy it, and it's going to be fun, and let's all just join in.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of links in with, there's an overall thing you can tie that to Caroline Ahern's career, really, which is the rejection of celebrity. She goes away.
Oh, hell yeah.
Because she doesn't, if anything, the consequences of the celebrity lifestyle are really personally unpleasant for her. The royal family, there would have been all sorts of ways that you could have introduced celebrities into that, but no, it's about the domestic family. So I do think, when you're looking at this, it's this kind of starting as you mean to go on. I mean, one thing I did find quite striking was so this is February 1995. Within 5 years, she'll have achieved everything, and almost it'll be very much at the end. I hadn't really appreciated just how compressed that timeline was. If you think about a comedy program that started in 2020, you're kind of expecting those people to still be at the top of the game. So yeah, a lot happens in a short space of time that kicks off with this episode.
You're very right, and it's almost like her sort of her descent. I don't want to say, don't mean in a negative context necessarily, but her sort of shying away
Yeah.
leaves space for the office, right? Like
Yeah.
basically when the royal family ends, the office takes over 2000, 2001. So yeah, you do see that. But I think there's that notorious clip, isn't there? It's like at the comedy awards where she's like mouthing off at the side of the stage and Paul O'Grady says
Yeah,
some.
shouting like get on with it and stuff. I mean, if there was one criticism I would have had of that documentary that went out on Christmas Day, I would love to see the kind of supercut version that has some of
Mm.
that stuff in. And because I guess the
Oh God, yeah.
BBC researchers will have collected all of this stuff and then had to sift through it. And oh yeah, I would really enjoy that stuff. Though, yeah, it's tricky. But Carolina Hearn and Craig Cash drunk at award ceremonies is exactly what I want to watch.
Oh God, yeah, no. And if you go on Getty Images and you search either of their names, you can find some
Yeah,
great
yeah,
pictures. You can find some
yeah.
great pictures there, and I definitely approve. But yeah, we get a little teaser of the opening. Debbie McGee gets mentioned as well, and Hooky gets teased, and Hooky and the boys. And like you say, I think it is great there because so much of the comedy comes from Mrs. Merton being an old lady and doing old lady, old person stuff with old people, but it also comes from that dissonance, right? And what's more dissonant than Mrs. Merton to Hooky and the boys?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of the reason why that side of it works. It's um, the Mrs. Merton character kind of bridge between these old people in the audience and then the youth culture that the program kind of hovers around.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we get into our first interview now. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to going through this whole series, Fergal, because we've got like, I think it's like 30 odd episodes to get through. There's like 4 seasons and lots of specials of this. But all the celebrity guests, all of these guests that are on the show are big celebrities in the 90s. Like, there are certain lesser names like Chris Greener that we'll get to and certain kind of select guests or whatever. But for the most part, it's not like B-list. The B-list didn't really even exist in the 90s, didn't it? It was like, if you're on TV, you're probably sort of quite famous in a way. So I'm looking forward to discovering all these people. And I must say, I knew the name Chris Akabusi. I love battle rap. He was often used as a punchline there. But I wasn't too familiar with the man, were you?
No, I mean the first question that Mrs. Merton asked is what do you do sports wise? That was basically
Yeah.
me on Google when he came on. So I mean,
Yeah.
I hope you've done your research on Chris Akabusi.
I've done an MBE, Chris Akabusi. I've learned a lot about this man, and he is quite a track and field star. He became a British broadcaster and went down that route. But yes, his highest placing was silver medal at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, which is crazy. At the 4x400 meters relay, also got bronze, 2 bronzes at the Barcelona Olympics, and set a British record in the 4x400 relay. And respectfully to athletics as well, there's lots of world championships and European championships, and I love that stuff. But the Olympics is where us normies pray. But yeah, no, he was a big star here, and he is like an eccentric match for her, and I think they blend quite nicely.
Oh, I think it's such a good start to it. If
It
anything,
is.
it's almost quite disarming about what will happen later in the entire
Yeah.
series because you watch it and here's this guy who he's almost like a hype man for her. He's continually
Yes.
going, "Oh, Mrs. Merton." He's really game. Any question that she asks, he
Mm.
really plunges into. He's in. I mean, I don't know if he's always in that good spirits, but he really brings it. It kind of and that helps. It settles you into the program.
It does, it does, and he was on the Big Breakfast, Record Breakers, as they say, Question of Sport. Currently, and Fergal, I know you're a politically interested man. I appreciate it. You're a Tribune, bigwig. Akabusi's regular on GB News now.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. I think the pipeline of people who appear on the Mrs. Merton show are in the late 30s and 40s, and anyway now on GB News. I'd watch out for that. There'll probably be a few.
Yeah, there's probably gonna be a few. So when he's introduced, then, because this is obviously another classic trope of the chat show, here's the guest. And it's like, I'm thinking of like Friday Night with Jonathan Ross, and they're behind the doors and they open and, all this sort of thing. They come off stage and whatnot. And I love what they do here, Fergal, where basically, so it cuts to Chris Akabusi, the doors pull back. Oh, it's Chris. But you can see, I don't know if you noted this, but behind him, you see like a little table and lamp which looks like something out of a nan's front room. Like it's just kind of there, but it's very clever.
Ah, no, yeah, I didn't really think too much about the design choice.
Mm.
In terms of the stuff on the actual set, I was just getting a bit of a rush from seeing the settee that they're on, which is
Yeah.
very, even trying to be kind of like 90s TV studio glamour, is you
Mm.
don't really see settees like that very much. So we just, yeah, the main sort of one they're on was a real 90s hit, which is some of what we watched this for.
Oh yes, absolutely. And yet, like you say, he buys into the mythology, and he talks about certain eras and goes back in time, but he is an eccentric fellow. And I'm surprised they kept this in this bit early on, where basically Mrs. Merton asks, "How did you know you were a runner?" And he gives this bizarre answer where he says, "Oh, it was my mother who realized because I dribbled down her breast. I was a breastfed baby." It's like
Yeah.
it's this like almost disaster that she rescues really well.
So, what sort of thing? It was running, wasn't it?
That's what we're living now and again. I'm only run to the toilet now, but yes, I used to run when I was on the track and do the hurdles, by the way.
The hurdles as well.
Didn't you see the entrance where I jumped over
I
the...
did, it was marvellous.
Do it again?
I was,
No,
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 you-
I was trying to watch it, but it was the aftershave. Wasn't it? No. But tell us, when did you realise first that you could run?
I suppose really it was my mother who realised because I, dribbled down her breast when I was... No, that's breastfed. I was a breastfed baby, you see, that's what I meant.
Oh, wait.
But actually, no, I
I
don't...
wasn't actually asking you that.
Yeah, I mean that it happens a couple of times, even just in this episode, where the kind of answers that you might think that Mrs. Murr would try and goad someone into, people just sort of say straight away. So I don't know whether that is a function of this little old lady person that actually people just come out with weirder stuff than they normally would do.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, because I think like when you're doing a TV show and it's the artifice and you've had makeup and there's lights and there's camera and it's an old lady looking at you, it's a granny and there's all grannies around you. I think you're right. I think it would lead to certain things. But and what I like as well about the interviews throughout is Mrs. Merton calls back to her own mythology. She calls back to her friends and her husband. She mentions her friend Lily that reminds her of Chris Akabusi because she laughs from morning to night, then clarifying she's a bit simple, really, at the end.
Yeah, that was a really, really funny joke. I enjoyed that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's also she plays to her audience very well. Where I think Chris Akabusi says a line and he thinks it's like an innuendo, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't mean that," and she's like, "Oh, they won't get that. You can be as loose as you like."
Well, there's this really good kind of what you would now call world building going on, where within a few minutes you kind of, if you'd have been turning this on the night, you kind of have an understanding of who Mrs. Merton is, her
Yes.
friends who are other old people, her position to them. She's surrounded by all these people who are, in her words, a bit simple or senile. And so she has a lot of fun with that.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it is a pilot episode, but I think you're meant to believe this is like season 9 or something, and it's just been going on like.
Yeah, that it's been long running and there are kind of just interruptions into this thing that, because I think one of the funny things about the Mrs. Merton construct is she also does have quite a high opinion of herself as a kind of broadcasting
Yeah,
style.
yeah.
I bet they are.
Before the old Leica shorts came in, we used to have these real short shorts.
Yes.
And I can remember one of my... you remember those very short
do,
shorts?
yes.
Back in your day, Mrs. Merton?
Yes.
Well, I can remember one of my very first races, being a big wig, everyone easy with a big wig, being one of these top-class
I
athletes.
don't think they got it. You be as easy as you like with it. Go on.
Mrs. Again, what I love about these episodes are so many references that are like lost to time. So she references the fact that Manchester didn't get the Olympic Games, I suppose.
Well, that one was interesting to me because I think that was possibly a joke that had been, because you see a little bit in this series, there's a bit of joke recycling going on from between this and the royal family.
Oh, there's a lot of that, yeah.
Yeah, so I think so. The Manchester Olympic bid, that was 1990, and that joke is really funny. We're like, well, we had the drugs. I'm convinced you'd have been said that's a very 1990 joke because that would have been
Yeah.
people of Manchester drugs and stuff. So I can imagine as soon as Olympics, we'll get in that really good joke from a few years ago because that was
Yes.
the Olympic bid, which was Bob Scott, and there's a really good book by a guy called Isaac Rose about Manchester called The Rentier City, where he kind of goes on about the Olympic bid and Bob Scott actually being more influential than anything Tony Wilson did. So weird, interesting, forgotten Manchester history.
And yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because there's so many lines throughout the Mrs. Merton show, throughout every episode maybe not every episode, but very regularly, where you're like, oh, that's a Royal Family line. That's a Royal Family idea. I mean, particularly in this episode, the one that I noted was everyone remembers that famous moment where Dave won't take his jacket off. You know, you won't feel the benefit when you go outside. And that's a direct line that Mrs. Merton says to one of the ladies in the audience. You won't feel the benefit, Gene, when you go outside. So it's cool to see that.
Yeah, and it's fair enough as well. I get like I've done this in writing. You know, if you said
Yeah.
response that was quite good, well, you know that there's not really much of a chance of the same audience for one thing are going to be the exact same audience for
Yeah.
another. And I mean, the jokes she does repeat, I mean, they are really funny, like the body shop fell on a dog one.
Yeah.
Or
Oh,
something.
no, they're all great. I'm glad she did it. I'm glad she did it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't begrudge it because it's almost just kind of fun recognizing it. It's like this is cool that it kind of because I guess it lived a different life. But any final thoughts on the old Chris Akabusi chat initially?
No, I think it's a really good introduction to the program. I think that one really works really well.
And it's so interesting, and this is probably quite a rare thing where the first episode of a TV show has its most iconic moment. But we're now getting on to Debbie McGee. So, obviously we'll get to the line shortly, but Debbie McGee comes way of Paul Daniels. And I have a weird memory of going to Toys R Us when I was like 9 and getting a Paul Daniels magic set that came with a VHS that we watched downstairs, and it had the same 20 crappy magic tricks that every set has. But I've always been aware of Paul Daniels. Do you have any memories of Paul Daniels or Debbie McGee?
Oh, honestly, not at all. That is like I do think that must have been something where by the time I was watching a lot of TV, the Paul Daniels wave must have
Yeah.
fallen a little bit. It must have been
Yeah.
like a year,
It was like a
years.
70s, 80s wave mostly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when watching this, it was the first time I'd ever actually thought in depth about because so Debbie McGee comes on and like she looks like
Yeah.
Sabrina Carpenter or something. She looks really glamorous and fantastic. And
Yeah.
yeah, it must have been this real celebrity odd couple where they
No,
were at.
they were. Yeah, so she's 37 here, and Chris Akabusi's 37. Interestingly enough, I just sort of like to age them here.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Paul Daniels story. I read into this morning actually doing the research. So essentially, 1979, she is scouted in the West End or whatever to go on this BBC show, and she joins it, and she's 21 at the time, and Paul Daniels is 41, and from there, basically, what made you fall in love with the millionaire Paul Daniels? I guess.
Yeah, it's I don't know how much that would necessarily fly these days.
Well, he wasn't a millionaire there. We should clarify. And Paul Daniels has mentioned this a lot because obviously this was a famous clip. So it was before. But I mean, regardless, I think it's an insanely funny line, cutting line, and just perfect, isn't it?
Oh, I mean, the way that has, you're right, that line has lived in the culture. You
Yeah,
see,
yeah.
BBC political journalists will use it as a frame of reference to set up
Mhm.
a kind of line about a decision being made. I think it's possibly one of those things that now where it's in circulation, people might not even know the genesis of it, the kind of the rhythm
Yeah,
of
I
the
think
show,
so.
what first attracted to you, to then the second part of it, really obvious thing that would attract
Yeah.
someone. It was like the venal motives. So I mean, to watch it, yeah, I mean, when I was talking about with my sister Ellie watching that first Mrs. Merton episode on Christmas Day a few years ago, watching that in its context and just how well it goes down and how impactful it was on the night. I mean, such a well-constructed joke. I would love to, if I was ever able to interview Craig Cash, I would love to ask about who wrote that specific line.
Me too.
Fantastic.
Paul's not here, you're everyone's. So, Debbie, you're very pleasing on the eye, if I might say. So I think Chris has realised that. Thank you. But what first, Debbie, attracted you to the millionaire Paul Daniels? Well,
Paul Daniels and Debbie are sort of beside the point in the line for me. I think it sets up the awareness that there is this disparity and whatever, and it exploits that. But I don't mean to be trite here, but that almost feels like an Oscar Wilde line. You know what I mean? It almost feels like a Shakespearean, like it's such an organic, natural comedy that what first attracted you to this thing that attracts everyone? Like it's just, I don't know, there's something so natural and poetic about it. I love it.
No, you're right. You're actually really right about Oscar Wilde, and I think in the same way, like it's got that standalone quality where
Mm.
which is such a hard thing to achieve into a sentence where actually you could tell that to someone and they would know it was funny because every part of that sentence is doing something interesting.
Yes, yes.
It's a really perfectly constructed joke. And we can intellectualize it a little bit, but it's just so funny how it goes down in the
Oh God,
room
yeah.
and
No, I
it
mean,
always touches on this thing that everyone must have been thinking a little bit as well, which makes it just that bit more
yeah,
savvy.
yeah. And to intellectualize it even more, what first? Like there's sort of just that primary thing, like what was the difference? But yeah, we don't want to. It's funny you mentioned as well. That was a very good point about like the line has sort of became a meme, right? It's kind of gone beyond wherever it originates from. And Debbie McGee herself was part of a meme before that because Paul Daniels would always say, and my lovely assistant Debbie McGee, and the lovely Debbie. I've heard that just throughout culture, the lovely Debbie, my assistant, like, it's kind of wild. So it was just, I guess we should put credit as well. I've not really thought of this in terms of the Mrs. Merton show, but for the casting of the interviewees, right? They seem to always really get it right. These kind of things that are going to spark, they're interesting, they're ironic. Like, there's no sort of dud guess for the most part.
No, not at all. And there's always I mean, I guess this is possibly the benefit of kind of this every nan persona is that there is always a kind of positioning that Mrs. Merton is able to have with them. So you have Ken Livingstone on, and
Mm.
obviously he's kind of suspicious of this leftist. You've got Boy George on, and Mrs. Merton can be quite conservative
Oh,
or
yeah.
naive about his, him being gay and things. So yeah, so she's able to find this really interesting way in. But you're right, whoever was booking them to get these people where it does just work really well. And like you said earlier, it's a really good summary of people who were at the top of the game in 1990s culture. And I love
Yep.
to have known who they also tried to get on and possibly didn't get. I don't know.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. But no, there's a lot. There's a lot of interesting ones. You mentioned the Boy George one there. I absolutely love that interview. I thought that interview was really funny. I watched that recently again. And but yeah, the majority, of course, it's not really about her. It's about Paul Daniels and how you're Paul Daniels' wife. And there's lots of sexual innuendo. Does he make things disappear? Does he make things pop out? But what I
That's
like,
the joke that goes
yeah,
down the best in the room, actually. Right? I thought we were watching the reactions. The millionaire Paul Daniels joke is really good, but when you got the one
yeah.
make things pop up, oh, it really sends all the old biddies. It's that's a real highlight in it for me.
It is, but you see the wit of Mrs. Merton throughout this because she says to Debbie, I'll give you a hypothetical question. And Debbie, I should say, is really good crack in this.
Yeah,
Like
she.
she's really likable. Like, she rolls with it and she enjoys it. But she says, like, I hit you with a hypothetical question. And Debbie says, that's a big word for you. And then you can see that she improvises there and she's like, oh yeah, but I got it out. That's magic, eh? Like, it's just like it's there. It's not particularly like the funniest line ever, because obviously that's magic, but just because it comes out then, it really surprised me when I watch it. Like it really makes me laugh.
But my husband, he's a great fan of
Oh, I
Paul
did. Oh,
Daniels.
yes. By the way, are you Paul Merton's mother? Someone told me.
No, not you. So, no, but my husband's a great fan of Paul Daniels. He really, really is. And that and anything with Alan Titchmarsh in.
Yeah, I mean, another bit where that kind of improvisatory stuff that comes out that's fantastic. So when Debbie McGee tells that story that just goes on a little bit too long about her seeing Chris Akabusi on
Yes.
the plane, and it's very, as a viewer, you're watching that and thinking, oh, this does have a slightly flirty edge to it. And when Mrs. Merton goes, oh, I'll bring in Paul Daniels, I think you forgot him there for a moment.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
It's so funny, and it gives you this glimpse when you read or hear people talk about what Carolina Home was like at the pub or at parties being
Yeah,
really
yeah, yeah.
withering. It's a really, really nice bit of that.
No, she says back to Paul Daniels. I think you've forgotten him for a moment.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
But it's
Yeah.
real though. It's not even like a jibe. You're like, hang on, yeah, she has been sort of indulging this a
Oh,
bit.
yeah,
So
I think what's so interesting about all the guests in different ways, but particularly that one, the kind of, I guess the reason why this sort of stuff works is give people enough rope and they'll hang themselves. So in
mm,
other celebrity formats, it can sometimes not work, but when someone actually does say something that kind of pushes themselves over the limit, that's such a really good and generous source of comedy. Because then you're not just laughing at someone, it is something that the audience has in real time been able to observe on their own terms.
No, for sure. I mean, there's so much funny stuff in this as well. And like I love when anyone ever tries to get one over on Mrs. Merton and they never do it, where Debbie says, "Are you Paul Merton's mother?" And Miss Merton says, "No, are you?" Two
Yeah,
words, two words she needs, and it's dynamite. Like,
yeah. I mean, that's possibly one that I don't know, maybe she'd had that before because Paul Merton
yeah,
was quite big at the
potentially.
time,
Sure,
but
sure.
she's very good at batting that away. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, she was incredible. So yeah, the Debbie McGee interview is terrific as well. They cram a lot into these half hours
Oh,
as
they
the show
get
would
by,
go
I think
on.
that's part of it. Yeah,
Yeah, but as the show would go on, they would cut down on the celebrity guests. They would normally have two, and they would do more audience work, which I don't think any of it. I know it's a satirical chat show, but a normal chat show would never do that. They cram another celebrity in, right? But I love that they went that way.
yeah, because I guess that is her real, or like the team realizing just how much the old people in the audience are a really generous
Yes.
source of that. Now, there is one moment in it where that guy asks a question,
Mm.
do you get backache to Debbie McGee? Is that Phil Mealy at all? I thought that looked like
Oh,
because
I
there
didn't.
are plants in the audience. That's one thing they do say in that Craig Cash interview with Jeff Lloyd is that if they knew they wanted to get something in a certain direction, there were some of their mates who would be in there to ask some leading questions. And he does look like a young Phil.
That's interesting. I think yes. I'll have to go back and watch myself, but I have noticed Phil Mealy less disguised in later episodes in the
Ah, well, there
audience.
we are then. Yeah,
So most likely it is him. Obviously, he was in disguise in The Queen of Sheba as Solomon, but
yeah.
you can notice it's Phil Mealy a mile off. So shout out to Duffy there. But no, that's interesting. And yeah, the question element as well. Like you say, I think it seems like it's always gold when she goes to the audience, but I feel like they're just funny in of themselves. Like I think this becomes very clear in the next interview with the very very tall man Chris Greener. But he comes on. He's a fascinating giant. This guy. He was a basketball player in the 60s and 70s for Crystal Palace and the Great Britain team. He had actually. This is a man who had a tumor at the base of his pituitary gland, and basically he grew and grew and grew, and he's 7 foot, 7 foot 6 inches. But what I love is he comes on, he's very genial. I really like this guy,
Yeah.
and he sits down with Mrs. Merton, and she's like, "Oh, aren't you tall?" And then she just asks several audience members if she thinks he's tall. It's brilliant.
Which is such Nan stuff as well.
Yeah,
Like, that's kind of why
it's
it's
like,
so.
do you think the tallest man in Britain is tall? It's great.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, that works really well. I mean, what you're saying before about the Aherniverse, had to make sure I get
Mm.
that right. It's quite good that there's a link between the Aherniverse and kind of the Lynchian world as well, with the fact he was in The Elephant Man. I quite obviously did
Oh my God. Wow. I love that.
that,
Yeah.
that, that one link between those two very distinct worlds is quite nice.
David Lynch on the Mrs. Merton show would have been amazing.
Yeah, God, yeah.
That could have happened. I mean, Twin Peaks is a bit before. But you mentioned, so yes, so we have Chris Greener here, and this is what I love about the show. We'll have, our big celebrity guests and stuff like that, but we'll just have interesting folk. They do this on talk shows in general. They often have like nature stuff on and whatnot, and just people who are intriguing for whatever reason. But yes, he was an actor in many movies, many big movies actually. He was in The Elephant Man, he was in Sky Bandits, he was in The Old Curiosity Shop. But essentially, he was also in the Super Mario Brothers movie in the work print, not in the final print. He was a voice in that. But yeah, he was mostly a giant because obviously he's a very very tall man, and I think this showcases a different side of Mrs. Merton. She's not the celebrity interviewer. She's the lifestyle kind of daytime talk show sort of interviewer here.
Yeah, and she gets it pitched really right as well, in that I think she works out what is funny about it and what isn't, and that she kind of leads him into this trap of talking about how he's typecast.
Yeah.
And I mean, he helps because he's a really good sport on it. He's
He's fantastic.
he
Yeah.
walks on. He's absolutely great.
No, no, he is. He reminds me of I forget his surname now. Chris, the guy who recently won Strictly, the blind
Yes, yeah,
comedian,
yeah, yeah.
who I think he's really, really funny. He's great. Have I got news for you? But again, it's not like there's no mockery here, so to speak. It's just kind of we're both making jokes about it. We're both kind of rolling with it. And although he does say something, and this is a joke, I know, but I was a bit like, oh, this is a bit where she asks him if he's married, and he says, even with these long legs, I can't run fast enough. And I was like, chill out,
Yeah,
Chris.
the setup for that joke is really good though, because she really
Oh no, you're right. The setup, yeah,
got the
dig into
smart
that.
in
Yeah,
slowly is like all the women here want to know how big, and it's really, really.
yeah, it's perfect.
And I think one of the nice things about the Mrs. Merton show with that is that if you look at where comedy went in the 2000s, there was often a real nastiness and going a little bit too far.
Mm.
You think Little Britain, but also a lot of other programs
Oh
which
yeah.
sea change. And one of the really striking things, and why I just keep going back to it between the Mrs. Merton show and the Royal Family is it's very positive. It's very within the line, but just prodding up against it, and it's always just so well judged. So that interview is a really good example of that for me.
Do you like animals, Chris?
Do I like animals?
Yes.
I love them.
Do you?
Yes.
Why are baboons' bottoms so red? Something I always wonder about.
Well, it's funny you should say that because actually I do wonder about that as well.
But, I take it you've never done anything to stunt your growth like smoking or any other dirty
No.
See, Bernard, this could have been you. It's been marvellous having you on, Chris. It really, really has. If you get any taller, Chris, will you come back and tell us all about it? Yeah.
I'd be delighted to.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, will you thank Chris Greener? Thank you very much.
Yes, it is. And also, she asks like, have you ever smoked? Have you ever tried to stunt your growth? And then, and it's a good example there where she's talking to Chris, and then she just turns to Stan and says, "See, Stan, if you didn't smoke, you could be as tall as him," sort of thing. And then goes back to Chris and just, I don't know, has it all kind of measured out. It's a brief interview. It's like 2 minutes or so. It doesn't really go on too long. It's kind of fun that they just sort of wedgie this in the middle. But yeah, and yeah, I'd say he's a really funny one. Like he says, like he auditioned for the dwarf role but couldn't fit into the costume and stuff like that. And he actually lived till 2015. Chris Greener passed away at the age of 71, and his funeral was widely reported. He seemed like a great man. So R.I.P. to him. But she interviewed a very tall man there, and our final guest was a giant star at the time. He had been bubbling for a while, but at this point, we had just had Knowing Me, Knowing You on the BBC, and Alan Partridge was, a nationwide name. Cool to see Steve Coogan here as the last guest.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is just if I was going to kind of like desert island discs, but of sort of comedy clips, I really would keep this. I think as very similar to you, I grew up with both Steve Coogan and Caroline Aherne,
Mm-hmm.
different figures in some ways who've done really, really different things. But Steve, it's just fantastic. So Coogan, when he comes on, there's already been this dynamic set up at the start of the episode where she kind of views him as a show off and couldn't resist
Yeah,
being.
yeah, yeah.
The way that she's going to talk about him is kind of seeded from the start of it. And out of all the guests, possibly because, which I'm sure we'll talk about, he had this friendship with Caroline Aherne that went back a couple of years. He looks a mixture of terrified, trying not to laugh, suppressing a laugh.
Yeah.
It's really fantastic stuff just from the first few seconds.
It is indeed, yeah. She says, let's have a madcap 5 minutes with Steve Coogan. House of Fun is played by Hooky and the boys. And, she says, who are you? And he's like, who am I? Like, he sort of questions himself for 1 millisecond. He says he does funny voices and funny characters on television. And I recently, maybe about a year ago or so, listened to his autobiography on my Spotify Audible 20 hours a month or whatever. And he spoke of Caroline Aherne quite widely, actually, early on, just admiring her and such like that. And they obviously had quite a deep friendship. But yeah, he was pinned as this guy for a long time, the funny voice guy. That was his sort of thing, the spitting image guy, the very young guy that came through. But at this point, he really was a kind of supernova star, the Alan Partridge stuff and whatnot. So it's fun to see him here. And like you say, yeah, he does seem quite nervous. He does seem quite kind of, he's laughing almost at the fact that it's Caroline talking to me rather than it's Mrs. Merton.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the history is really interesting. obviously it's Manchester, the early 90s. There's a lot of alcohol going on, so no one remembers exactly
Mm.
who met who when. But they meet in the early 90s around Stockport's KFM radio. And so
Yeah.
they're both doing quite a lot of the same gigs. There is a good story about Carolina Hearn being at a house party when Steve Coogan gets an audition for the Royal Shakespeare Society, and at Hearn saying, "Oh, Royal Shakespeare Society, no one listens to them,"
Yeah, yeah,
which is
yeah,
really
yeah.
funny. And so it just establishes this kind of dynamic where, which you mentioned about him having been known in the 80s as this kind of spitting image comedy voices. This bit of footage is really similar to what Coogan and Bryden would do in The Trip, where
Yep.
you've got Steve Coogan as the one with pretensions and ambitions and trying to show that he's this serious actor, and the other person, so Rob Brydon or Carolina Hearn, trying to make them do an impression of Neil Kinnock or Frank Spencer. And I could just watch hours of that stuff, really. It works really, really well.
Yeah, and this is an impression heavy sequence, as you say. And I mean, again, we're not here to critique impressions. The impressions are decent. I feel like it's funny because I was coming this via The Trip, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
and I think Rob Brydon's Ronnie Corbett is incredible in that. And like Coogan's is a bit more, but I think it was a different era, wasn't it? I feel, Mike Yarwood is invoked later on, the
Yes.
classic 70s impressionist. And I feel like the very fact that you could somewhat, emulate their kind of persona. Well, I'm not saying these aren't great impressions, but you know what I mean? I think maybe we're spoiled in these TikTok, Insta real worlds.
Has that Debbie McGee gone? Yes? Oh, do Paul Daniels for us. We'd love to see it.
Now you will like this. Not a lot, but you'll like it.
But most comedians, behind their happy, happy face, there is a sad secret. What's your sad secret? Get it out on national television. Give it an opening.
I've got a bit of flab round my waist.
Can we see it?
No.
Do Frank Spencer again then.
Yeah, people do ones that are just it's just how it's got much more sophisticated and much
Yeah,
more, even just down to how like quality of audio mics have changed things and stuff
true,
like
true.
I can't remember the guy who does the Trump impression on SNL, for example.
Oh, the modern one.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Just kind of the expectations of what people would do with impressions is really different. And I guess also Coogan probably hadn't been doing those impressions for a few years because one of the funny things about them is they are not massively relevant impressions she's asking him to do. And that's
No,
what
of course. Yeah,
all
yeah,
the old
yeah.
biddies want to hear the 70s reference points. I mean,
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
getting though. So this is on the Friday, he does the impression of Neil Kinnock. I just managed to looking into it. Neil Kinnock resigns from being an MP on the Monday.
Wow, I yeah,
Those two events linked.
The Neil Kinnock impression is really interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like it's a voice lost to time. I feel like it's not one of those voices people remember.
No, not at all. I mean, the fact that he resigned a few days after it, he wouldn't.
Mm,
He'd lost the election 3 years ago, so it's as memorable as sort of. I think we've had so many people who've lost elections,
well,
but
indeed.
yeah, I mean, it is one that has been lost to time a little bit. If you were to go into a pub now and do an impression of Neil Kinnock, it wouldn't really get much sort of resonance.
No, no, and it's like I'd love to do a good Harold Macmillan, but again,
Yeah,
he's not
yeah,
a
yeah.
voice that people really recall.
He kind of does that. Coogan does do that good joke, obviously riffing on how dated the impressions are. Kind of trying to do Harold Wilson next.
Yes, well, exactly, exactly. So there's a lot of impression. Frank Spencer gets invoked as well, which obviously all the old biddies love, and yeah, the fact that Debbie McGee is gone, so he can do Paul Daniels, and he digs into that, and it's just fun that in the same way Debbie McGee is Paul Daniels' husband, Paul Daniels' wife, Chris Akabusi. I don't know what he does. I think he's wired up, and I'm going to ask him about this a lot. And Steve Coogan, he does funny voices, so I'm just going to put a lot of pennies in the machine and get him to do them.
Yeah, and there's that quite good moment of almost breaking the fourth wall and not doing it, where she goes, "Oh, she's asking him about knowing me, knowing you, and doing the fake."
Yes. Wow. Yeah.
And it's good because she pitches it of like, oh, that's a really original idea. So it's at once referencing the format that she's doing. It's at once having a bit of one over on Steve Coogan in that actually this idea you've got is one that I've been doing for quite a while. But also she isn't breaking. She isn't looking to the camera. There isn't a wink there.
No.
So it's this really good sustained little moment. I think that's really, really wonderful. There's that
No,
really good picture from 1997 of Steve Coogan, Carolina Hearn, and Noel Gallagher as well, which are
I
just like,
love that picture. Yeah.
yeah, like up to the point where I should get a sort of framed version of it because they
I,
all,
I I feel I want it as well. I mean,
yeah.
Steve looks whacked out of his gourd, respectfully, as do
Yes,
they
yeah, yeah. I'm
all.
glad you
And
said
and I
it.
feel like in a loving way, not in a lascivious way, he is like cupping Carolyn Ahern's bosom as well.
Yeah, there's two pictures that I was taken in quick succession. And there's one that is a lot more sort of dignified than the other, but it's really sweet and it speaks
Oh
to
yeah, it's not like it's a great picture. I agree. I love it.
yeah. I mean, three people who've all come from
Three
the
icons, three true icons. Like,
yeah, and at the peak of their powers as well. If you think about
mm,
1997, you got Noel Gallagher in the biggest band on the planet, Carolina Hearn having just debuted the Royal Family, Steve Coogan. That picture is taken after one of the opening nights of Is the Man Who Thinks He's It show.
right.
So, oh yeah, it's a real snapshot in time.
And obviously, Half the World Away was the Royal Family theme tune. So more
It,
Aherniverse, Oasis are in the Aherniverse deep, but that is don't Oasis? I think they get referenced in the Royal Family, or does he say
yeah,
like,
his exit are
yeah, yeah,
is kind of a cross between Oasis and the Manics, I think.
that's right, that's
Yeah.
right. And again, it's like the fact that they do the theme tune, I love it. It's I don't know if you're a Sopranos fan, but it's always weird to me that they bend the meta so well. But HBO is never referenced in the Sopranos. But I love that the Royal Family goes a bit for I mean, obviously the Royal Family's on the BBC, and they watch the BBC, and so it's just glorious.
Well, they're very good. I think they're very good at earning cash, but also I think that generation more widely. The people who were making TV comedy in the 1980s, they weren't necessarily people who'd grown up with and loved telly. But by the time you get to the 90s, you get to Ahern, you get to Coogan, you get to Chris Morris. They're
Mm,
all really fluent in television. And so, because they
yeah.
were steeped in it. Ben Thompson's book Sunshine on Putty is a really good book about the 1990s British comedy. And Gary's main thesis in that, after I spoke to everyone, was just, yeah, they love telly and they were able to subvert it. And so they're really good at knowing where that line is. Like in the same way, bringing it back to tonight's episode, that in the Royal Family, you've got Dave doing an impression of Paul Daniels. And people will have known that there
Yeah.
was that history with Carolina Hearn and Debbie McGee and things. So, yeah, they are very good at sort of going up to the edge with it.
Sunshine on Putty. I've never heard of that. I'm just looking at it now. I need to buy that, clearly.
It's good if you like. So Ben Thompson is really good. He still writes quite a lot and he's a really interesting cultural critic. But that book it's kind of cobbled together of various interviews and profiles he did of comedy people in the 90s all put together.
Mm,
It's great because it's very gossipy. There's quite a lot. There's a good 20 pages all in all about Carolina Hearn. Peter Kay's in it, but kind of fixing a bit of a Peter Kay tradition. He's quite distant, and Steve
yeah, yeah,
don't
yeah.
find out much about him. Yeah, really good book.
I
I
know,
recommend.
no, I will check that out. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm just looking at the cover now. It's got caricatures of Alan Partridge, Vic Reeves, Harry Hill, Carolyn Ahern's on the sofa in the middle, and there's
Mhm.
David Brent at the front as well in a Jim Royal chair.
So that yeah, that's got to sell it to your
Oh my
audience,
god. Yeah.
hasn't it? So,
So
yeah,
I'm sure we sold a few copies right now. But yeah,
yeah,
Sunshine
yeah.
on Putty. Maybe I'll do a little review on the channel actually in the future. That sounds really cool. So and yeah, that pretty much takes us to the end of the episode. Mrs. Button, thanks everyone. And then we get Fergal what you never see now in TV shows. Like when it gets, I watch everything on streaming pretty much. It's not that I really watch credits anymore. But when credits happen, they just get smudged to the side and advertising runs down. But here is a bona fide closing credit sequence where the main theme that we both love is played as a rocked up version by Hooky and the Boys. The credits are rolling down the screen. We're still in the TV studio. And then we see most of our elderly audience, most of the elderly audience just rocking their hands back and forth in unison. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it's very Blackpool the way that the
Oh
audience are
yeah.
into it. I mean, that group of old people do not need persuading to sway and
Mm.
sing along to the song, and yeah, it really sends you hope. You sends you away with a kind of real feeling of positivity. As we said earlier, it's such an uplifting theme tune. The way it closes kind of locates you back in that really great humor of all the old people in it. It's great. I was having to, because obviously I play a stream in, it automatically gets you on to the next episode.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
flicking around to really soak up every last second of it.
Yeah, no. And that brings us to the end then of the first episode. So any closing thoughts of the first episode of Mrs. Burton Show?
No, not at all. I think we covered a lot of it, but I'm definitely now going to go away and binge the rest of it. It's kind of only underlined to me just how dense a text it is. And because similar to you, coming to it later in life, yeah, I feel I've still got a lot to learn. So I'm looking forward to the other episodes that you do.
No, I appreciate you coming on. Finally, what do we want to point people towards? Anything, any social media presence or?
Yeah, I mean, social media is a bit tricky at the moment because I would have just said go on my Twitter, but that's X, and I'm not really on that for various quite obvious
Yeah.
reasons. But I mean, the only stuff I'd really promote is at the start of this year, I did an article for the Londoner about a house in Lewisham. That's a lot of Windrush history. If that's interesting to you, look for that. New Statesman did an article about the British Geordie singer-songwriter Richard Dawson. But no, basically, just if you're listening to this, you'll possibly quite like the Royal Family at 25 episode. So
It's in the description, people. If you listen to this, it's down there. And yeah, read it. It's a great read. And I want to urge people as well, the Royal Ramble pod at gmail.com. If you want to come on and you want to discuss, like Fergal, an episode of the Mrs. Merton Show, there is so much that we have to get through in the future. There are so many guests, like you mentioned, Boy George, Michael Parkinson. I'm just thinking Jonathan Ross was on here. Johnny Briggs and Amanda. Oh, why am I not seeing her surname? Oh, sorry, Amanda Barry. As a late 90s Corrie fan, if you remember Mike Baldwin and Ulmer, that is a fantastic interview. Keith Chegwin, Mr. Motor. Well, oh God, Mr. Motivate. He should be on there. Dale Winton, Ken Livingston, as you mentioned. So it's just like it's a very consistent show. As someone who's watched it the whole way through, like it doesn't really flag. As funny as this episode is as funny as they all are, really. And some of them are better than others, and some of them are quite like like you say, bristly. Like the Bernard Manning one. Like things are put on the table.
Yeah, that'll be a really good episode when you get to that, actually, because that's quite a complex text, isn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of how, I mean, that's rightly been framed as kind of one of the most interesting things Carolina Hearn does. And it's just such an ambiguous moment because though Carolina Hearn really brings the audience on side against Bernard Manning, it's very, the seesaw is going up and down throughout that interview. And it's, very, very interesting stuff. So you'll have a really good chat about that.
All right. Well, again, the Royal Ramble pod at gmail.com. If you want to email me there, get in touch with me. If you want to come on the show, Patreon is available if you want to listen to the Grapes tapes. And these episodes as well will be on there a month ahead of time. And Fergal, thanks again for coming on. This has been great.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely loved it. Thank you very much for having me on. Nice one.
Tom Quee presents The Royal Ramble, an episode-by-episode celebration of the classic British sitcom The Royal Family. To get in touch with the show, email us at theroyalramblepod@gmail.com.